How's it going, class? Jacob here, and welcome to our presentation on reparations for those affected by racism condoned by the United States. Our presentation will first begin with exploring what reparations would look like before transitioning into the groups that will be receiving said reparations. Our third talking point will be the aftermath of reparations post-implementation, and finally, we will explain how reparations will eliminate prejudice. How's it going, everybody? Just real quick, Jacob here. Wanted to interject before Rose gets us started. Kind of wanted to explain our reasoning for choosing to do a PowerPoint presentation. First off, we wanted this to mimic a lesson plan, right? So going with an art installation, anything kind of a too crazy, creative, unique kind of way might have detracted from us actually able to provide the relevant information. We did consider a website, but we did fear that it would detract from allowing us to kind of do a buildup of reasoning. And a buildup of reasoning was important when it came to, explaining our ideas for reparations, right? Because we kind of wanted all of our background examples to kind of pyramid or, maybe slope up to the crux of this course, which is about eliminating prejudice, right? So those are the reasons why we chose to go about this in a presentation. And also the presentation format in a PowerPoint also allows each member to really flesh out all the findings they had. We all spent a lot of time doing research, taking notes, and just kind of getting our ideas together. So a presentation kind of honors our time as well, and we hope you all enjoy it. Without further ado, Rose, take it away.
So this is what reparations would look like. So let's start with a history of reparations, because if we want to know the best way to give reparations out, we should at least study past cases of other governments giving out reparations. The United States is not the only country with a past history of maltreatment of their people, so there are many examples of reparations to choose from. Types of reparations fall into two categories: complaints filed in court or governmental administrative schemes. The court complaints can be thought of as the equivalent of any civil case in the United States where someone is suing over physical damages. The governmental administrative schemes have come in the form of cash payments, trust funds, land restitution, and developmental programs. Now, let's go into some examples of reparations. On the civil lawsuit side, a class action lawsuit filed against former dictator of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, resulted in $1.2 billion in exemplary damages and $766 million in compensatory damages. The benefit of the lawsuit method is that it allows for the victims to publicly tell their stories, which showcases the horrors of the damages done. More common is the use of governmental administrative schemes. After the Holocaust, the German government paid out billions of dollars worth of reparations to people who were in concentration camps and to organizations that helped non-Israeli Jewish victims. In Argentina, the military dictatorship was responsible for the disappearance of over 10,000 people, as well as forcing people into detention camps. The Argentine government paid varying amounts of money to the families of the disappeared and gave long-term bonds to those that were in detention camps. After the war in Sierra Leone, the government set up a trust fund for victims of the war so that foreign funds could help with rehabilitation. As you can see, reparations have been used in many ways by many different governments. Now, how would reparations be paid out in the US? To start, they should not come from the tax money of citizens because nobody currently alive was around to legally enslave others in the United States. However, many corporations and organizations that either indirectly or directly use slavery are still around today. Because of this, we think that reparations for slavery should come straight from the corporations that profited off of the backs of slaves. For example, Wells Fargo purchased slaves to own and accepted them as collateral for many different clients. And every Ivy League school, except for Cornell, recruited and raised money from slave-owning families. Brown University actually just voted to give reparations to the families affected by their condoning of slavery. For American Indians, there are no corporations that have explicitly exploited them, but the federal government has notoriously treated Indians awfully. Because Indian law is so complex, due to the fall of the federal government, it leaves reservation Indians in a state of constant poverty with no way out. Because all Indian land is owned by federal government, Indians cannot mortgage their assets for loans, making it extremely difficult to start a business. On Indian land, companies need to go through a 49-step process to get an energy development permit, while for normal circumstances, it only takes 4 steps. In addition, there's a federal law which requires Indian land to be fractionated by bloodline, so there are many pieces of land that have multiple owners, generally in the hundreds of owners. The natural resources on Indian land are also in abundance. Estimates are around that there are $1.5 trillion worth of resources on Indian land. However, due to federal restrictions, Indians cannot make any use of this in order to help their communities. With all this being said, there should be a class action lawsuit filed by a coalition of Indian tribes against the federal government for their continued abuse of natives. Also, Indian tribes should be allowed governance of their own land with minimal federal restrictions so that they can use the land to help them make money. There is quite a large correlation between groups marginalized by the government and the rate of poverty in those groups. As you can see, Native Americans have the highest poverty rate of any racial groups, which is due in part to many of the earlier described practices. Black people have the second highest rate of poverty at 20.8%. These are also the percentage of people living below the federal poverty level, which is ridiculously low to begin with. For example, the cutoff family yearly income for a family of 4 is only $26,500, which probably would not be able to support a family of 4. This means that there are probably countless other Black people and Native Americans that are living just above the poverty line, but get no federal assistance. Because of the disproportionate rates of poverty for historically oppressed groups, reparations for past actions should be enacted by organizations such as corporations and the federal government. Now that we have established that reparations need to be paid, we need to explain why reparations for slavery cannot come from taxpayer money. To start, nobody today has legally made the choice to enslave others in the United States. Many heinous actions that were previously condoned by the US are now heavily frowned upon. Also, having slavery reparations come from taxpayer money would definitely anger poorer whites, Asians, and Hispanics, further increasing political division in the nation. Given the unique circumstance of the federal discrimination against American Indians, though, any money that Indian tribes receive should come from the federal government because of their cruel past against Indians. This is why the Indian reparations should come from a court case so that they can be justly given with no political bias. In addition to monetary payments, reparations could also come in the form of preferential treatment. We already do give preferential treatment to veterans by allowing them to obtain free or low-cost education, unemployment assistance, getting extra points on civil service examinations, and housing, all through the GI Bill. This is preferential treatment due to the fact that veterans have served our country. However, slaves have also served our country, as much of the economic prowess of the United States could not have been possible if it was not for slavery. There is also a foreign precedent for giving marginalized groups veteran privileges. In Gorbachev's USSR, many cities gave Gulag survivors the same treatment as veterans, which included free passage on public transportation and priority access to housing and medical care. Whatever monetary payments that reparations would consist of should also include some sort of legislative reform, like the previously mentioned changes to Indian laws. Legislation would further raise awareness and try to correct our past without giving taxpayer money away.
A large question that comes with what reparations would look like is who should receive reparations and why. The answer to this question is easy to find when we take a look at America's long history of injustices and wrongdoings. The descendants of slavery and Native American tribes deserve reparations for America's vast number of atrocities against these groups. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan sought out to right a grave wrong by signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This legislation formally apologized for the government's forced relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II and established a $1.25 billion trust fund to pay reparations to those who were forced into internment camps. Japanese Americans deserve to be compensated for America's mistreatment of them. However, the United States has never apologized for the nation's treatment of enslaved people and their descendants. When James Forman, a civil rights pioneer, demanded 500 million in reparations in his 1969 Black Manifesto, he grounded his argument in an indisputable fact. Unpaid slave labor helped build the American economy, creating vast wealth that African Americans were barred from sharing. Some experts have calculated the worth of black labor during slavery as anywhere from billions to trillions of dollars. Outside of the gruesome labor that was forced upon slaves, they were also brutally punished and had terrible living conditions. Slaves were punished by whipping, shackling, beating, mutilation, branding, and/or imprisonment. Punishment was often meted out in response to disobedience or perceived infractions, but masters sometimes abused slaves just to assert their dominance. Pregnancy was not a barrier to punishment either. The mistreatment of slaves frequently included rape and sexual abuse of women as well. I've listed some of the crimes that were conducted against slaves, and this is just scratching the surface. Despite partaking in all of these atrocities, the government hasn't even formally apologized for slavery, let alone paid reparations. The descendants of slavery deserve to be compensated for the crimes against their ancestors that have led to numerous inequalities today. The question of reparations extends far beyond the roughly 4 million people who were enslaved when the Civil War started. Discrimination and state sanctioned um, brutality, dispossession, disenfranchisement, and murder all continued long after the war ended. That history profoundly handicapped Black Americans' ability to create and accumulate wealth, as well as to gain access to jobs, housing, education, and healthcare. But all of these issues stem from slavery and the history of continued racism that followed. The problems of injustice and racial prejudice against African Americans stems from slavery, and the American government needs to right its wrongs. America is not only built on slave labor, but it is also built on land that was stolen from Native Americans. The settling of what would eventually become the United States was a bloody affair. Between 1500 and 1800, as many as 20 million natives have died over the course of a few centuries. Indigenous people were forced to negotiate their disposition through resistance, war, coercive treaties, theft, and massacre. The removal and relocation of Native Americans from their homes and sacred lands helped spur the American economy. Settlers from all walks of life, including homesteaders, farmers, ranchers, railroad workers, soldiers, hunters, and many more, all benefited from the Homestead Act, the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and westward expansion. Not only were Native Americans forced to relocate off their lands, any resistance against the American government resulted in brutal massacres. Many men and children were brutally murdered, and women were raped and sexually assaulted, and the list goes on forever. The many horrors that were brought upon Native Americans by the U.S. government greatly impact Native Americans today. Native Americans struggle with impoverishment and unemployment, poor quality housing, inadequate health care, low levels of education, and natural resources exploitation. On top of this, Native Americans struggle with racism and prejudice, and their native language and culture is becoming extinct. The US government has tried reparations for Native Americans before, but they were very unremarkable. Native Americans enlisted in World War II in disproportionately high numbers. 44,000, or nearly 13% of the entire population of Native Americans at the time, served as code talkers who stumped the enemy with their tribal languages, and brave service members who fought in the European and Pacific theaters of the war. After World War II, momentum to compensate tribes for the unjust seizure of their lands grew. In 1946, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission, a body designed to hear historic grievances and compensate tribes for lost territories. It commissioned extensive historical research and ended up awarding about $1.3 billion to 176 tribes and bands. This may seem like a large figure, but the actual funds only averaged out to be about $1,000 per person of Native American ancestry, and most of the money was put in trust accounts held by the United States government, which has been accused of mismanagement over the years. Even after giving these minuscule reparations, the government didn't formally apologize for its mistreatment of Native Americans until 2009, and even that apology was empty. The 2009 apology from Congress was filled with coercive language and did very little to show genuine sympathy and regret for the mistreatment of Native Americans. Native Americans, along with the descendants of slavery, deserve to be compensated. The lost people, culture, and language of natives is invaluable and needs to be preserved. The American government's crimes have put Native Americans and African Americans in very dire socioeconomic conditions, and the government must atone for that.
One.
So next up, we're going to discuss the aftermath of reparations. So what we have seen is that there's often a lot of tension surrounding racial policies in the United States. We have seen riots and oftentimes increased prejudice due to these racial policies, and we will use some of these examples to predict the reaction and aftermath of the reparations. Some of these examples include the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, the Capitol insurrection, and the reactions to affirmative action. So what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia started because of a statue of Confederate leader Robert E. Lee that was voted to be removed. Essentially, alt-right protesters gathered against the removal of this figurehead of racism. A counter-protest against the alt-right also formed. And one very interesting thing to note is the contrast between the alt-right and counter-protesters. Counter-protesters prayed the night before and were very peacefully protesting. Meanwhile, the alt-right was much more aggressive with symbols of aggression like the torches that are seen in this photo. So what ended up happening as a result of these riots in Charlottesville, or the initial protest, was that they turned into riots, which were actually very one-sided, with most of the violence coming from the alt-right. And then essentially the police deemed that it was an unlawful assembly due to the violence. And all of this escalated from the alt-right not wanting to get rid of symbols of slavery and the suppression of Black people. And the very unfortunate part of the events in Charlottesville is that at the towards the end, somebody in the alt-right group ended up driving a car into a crowd of people, which killed one person and injured 19 more. And it was very unfortunate that this ended up being the outcome of the events in Charlottesville. So next up, we will look at the Capitol insurrection. So there are a few causes of insurrection, but a main one is that alt-right and pro-Trump groups were upset that the administration that they loved was leaving. The Trump administration cultivated discrimination with Trump's many racist and sexist comments. Comments included mocking Elizabeth Warren by calling her Pocahontas because she claimed she was of Native American descent. And Trump has also, quote unquote, said that laziness is a trait in Blacks. many phrases like these ended up creating a society that it was okay for many of these alt-right people to, or they thought it was okay to be racist. And a new administration would condemn racism that Trump's administration allowed. The new administration also included the first female, the first African American, and the first Asian American vice president in Kamala Harris. This contrast created a threat in the minds of the alt-right, and they rioted at the Capitol. So Trump ended up holding a speech near the White House, and Trump supporters gathered by his speech and also at the Capitol. As Trump finished his speech, rioters became violent, and Trump encouraged for his supporters to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol building. Rioters pushed back police and breached all security getting into the Capitol building. And on top of that, they also fought police inside the Capitol building. This was a threat to all the politicians that were in there trying to finalize the electoral vote count to eventually swear in President Biden in the upcoming weeks. And a very interesting thing to note is that there are often issues with police brutality and racism, and the rights will often support the police, saying that they're very hardworking and they deal with a lot of issues. But during this Capitol insurrection, the alt-right treated the police very poorly and seemed to be going against what they had said and many other racial problems. So finally, we'll look at affirmative action. So this is most similar to our reparations policy in terms of helping out people in need. So the affirmative action policy attempts to help minorities and women that have to help them get an equal opportunity for jobs and education. And it tried to bring an end to discrimination that has centuries-long roots. The big problem is that for centuries, minorities and women couldn't receive an education or work higher-end jobs, making it hard for them in today's world when they're actually allowed to go and pursue these opportunities. It overall tries to level the playing field. So many people have unfortunately been discriminated due to the affirmative action policies because many people view the policy as unfair. Additionally, it's common now for people to undermine success of minorities and women and attribute it to affirmative action. So when a minority or a woman ends up getting a great new job or gets into a top university, people will question if it was due to affirmative action, which is delegitimizing the success of these great accomplishments. Also, a common phrase that has come out of affirmative action is reverse discrimination, as white men will often try to blame their failure on affirmative action, saying that they are now being discriminated against. And then there have also been many court cases that have come out of affirmative action, including the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. In this case, Bakke said that he was discriminated against due to affirmative action because he was rejected from the University of California Medical School twice. He accused the school's policy of reserving 16% of their spots in the program for minorities. So overall, what we can predict, as we have seen, the alt-right has very rash reactions to policies like these. There will probably be a lot of initial backlash and increased discrimination due to this policy because they may view this as preferential treatment by the government. So I think society at first will look a little bit more like the top picture with riots and problems. There will also be similar reactions as there were from affirmative action because the alt-right might blame success on these reparations, saying it's unfair. There should also be, but meanwhile, there should also be long-term success for, like there was in affirmative action. So one thing that we can see that shows how affirmative action was successful is by looking at a statistic about women. So we know that before affirmative action, women had a very small role in the workforce, but women ended up making up 20 or 46.9% of the workforce, and they held 51.5% of managerial positions in 2012, which is a very large increase from the time that affirmative action started to 2012, which is a very positive impact that affirmative action did by offering many new opportunities. So there should be a similar long-term benefits for those that receive reparations, and it will give them a kickstart to create better lives and live lives of bliss, similar to in the bottom picture.
Next up, class, we will be finishing up this conversation by explaining how reparations would eliminate prejudice, the crux of this course. Before I continue with this section, I want you all to just think to yourselves for a couple of seconds what it means to you if you are to be an American citizen, and if you are proud to be one or not. I'll give you about 5 seconds, and then I'll go on to the next slide. After your own deliberation, I think I speak for many of us that we have mixed emotions, to say the least. It's no secret to any of you that the foundation of the United States is questionable at best, and that its history has been littered with atrocities. Slavery, the Native American genocide, you name it. This country has done some terrible things to different groups of people. Joe Fegan, author of Racist America, Roots, Current Realities, and Future Reparations, explains in detail how from the mid-1600s to the 1960s, the U.S. economy explicitly, yes, explicitly ran itself as a racist system that profited off, quote, Black labor in Native American lands. Because of this, white Americans have been accruing wealth for generations, while the aforementioned groups have not. More importantly, this anecdote from Fegan exposes how this system has had rippling effects. Since this system perpetuated oppression, prejudices, and biases about the descendants of slaves and Native Americans, then that means because of these prejudices and biases, these two groups have been afforded massively different expectations and experiences. It is integral that because of prejudice, bias, and these experiences of these aforementioned groups, that we attack this racist system. To attack the system, reparations are needed. Reparations would allow for togetherness among these groups. These reparations, as Roy Brooks put it in his book, Atonement and Forgiveness, a new model for Black reparations, will allow for the apology of the oppressor and its people to find it believable. In his words, reparations, quote, turn the rhetoric of apology into a meaningful reality, and thus help repair the damage caused by these atrocities and ensure they won't be repeated. On this note of fostering togetherness, I'd like to introduce to you who you see in the middle of the screen of the late Robert T. Matsui, also known as Bob Matsui. Bob Matsui was a congressman representing California's 5th Congressional District as a Democrat. Congressman Matsui, like other Japanese Americans during his time, was in an internment camp with his parents. After the passage of the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948, Congressman Matsui said, and I quote, that they were made whole again as American citizens in reference to Japanese Americans, according to an article published by History.com documenting his life. This sentiment shows the potential benefits reparations could have for the descendants of slaves and Native Americans. The reparations will be that sincere apology we just discussed that Roy Brooks brought up in his book, with the outcome hopefully mimicking what Congressman Matsui outlined. Continuing on the brief mention of reparations for Japanese Americans, Jennifer Harvey, author of the book Whiteness and Morality, Pursuing Racial Justice Through Reparations and Sovereignty, mentions that although the monetary value provided Japanese Americans was questionable, this group was still able to receive, quote, acceptance, which very important, and compensation of their rights, and we wish the same for these two groups. Receiving acceptance also allows for these two groups to assimilate into the United States the way they want to, something key for this idea of fostering togetherness. For so long, the US forced these two groups into breaking their backs for this country's well being. Jennifer Harvey detailed this by explaining the United States' history of using forced assimilation. Their actions caused great harm, for instance, in devastating Native American communities and their culture by taking their land, and what many people actually may not know, by forcing Native American children into white suburban communities, something these children were not prepared for, leaving lasting mental damage. The United States, as we all know, also participated in the slave trade, though depending on who you ask, including me, more like stealing, was considered one of the biggest human right violations that one can ever partake in. To make up for these traumas, reparations must be dealt so these groups can recover properly and finally, and I mean finally, decide how they wish to integrate themselves into this country. Coming into my final slide on how fostering togetherness through reparations eliminate prejudice, I want to discuss how reparations would be a great way to address white privilege. Charles P. Henry, author of Long Overdue, The Politics of Racial Reparations, is a firm believer that white privilege plays a big role in the continued perpetuation of prejudice toward minority groups in the US. Mr. Henry and Jennifer Harvey would agree that reparations would spark discussion in the role of white privilege, with Mr. Henry taking this idea a step further by saying that those who can recognize their privilege can begin to dismantle the prejudice they have of the descendants of slaves and Native Americans. A widespread recognition also inspires allyship, a key tool for challenging the system that perpetuates oppression and prejudice. This idea of challenging a racist system brings me to the second way reparations will eliminate prejudice, which is by dismantling barriers. This video by ABC News is an example of some of the ways reparations can dismantle barriers, specifically those set in place to oppress the descendants of slaves.
America owes the descendants of slaves the unabated opportunity that we were never given in this country.
Reparations in many forms for many crimes, not just enslavement.
An apology and recognition of all the harm that it has done for over 400 years. 40 acres and a mule so that they can begin to generate generational wealth for their families, and power to be a part of decision making.
Freedom. A freedom that doesn't give them anything but repays the damage that was done.
Opportunity to feel a part. We help build this country. We want to own businesses, re-own land and homes. America owes us our dignity.
Prejudice, as defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, deals in, and I quote, preconceived judgments and opinions. In order for prejudice to remain, there cannot be a change in the status quo. But in this class, we are here to change just that. We believe that dismantling oppressive barriers allows for prejudice to be eliminated by showing that the groups held down by these barriers are meant to be in the same places, literally and figuratively, as those who benefit from these barriers. So it begs the question, how does reparation implementation become a part of this process of dismantling barriers? Well, let me explain. In a CNN article written back in March of 2021, Raphael Bostic, president of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, said he believed that reparations would, one, there are grounds for such, but would also mainly address issues such as redlining and housing discrimination, which are barriers that have been inhibiting our two groups for some time now. Mr. Bostic also discussed how reparations would allow for these people to build generational wealth, something Roy Brooks also brought up in his book that I discussed earlier in this section. Generational wealth plays a massive role in eliminating prejudice, as these groups will be able to represent themselves in places that they were not before and show that they deserve to have a seat at the table just like everybody else. With generational wealth, these groups will also have better access to education and housing situations, hopefully eliminating, some level of redlining and housing discrimination. Continuing on this trend of money, I will wrap up my discussion with the role money in the hands of the oppressed can have in politics. Regardless of how you feel about money in politics, we can't deny its role when it comes to political representation. With money received via reparations, the groups we advocated for today can lobby for those who they believe can continue to break down not only the barriers we mentioned, but others as well. Instead of the descendants of slaves and Native Americans being exploited in elections year after year, being given fake promises, these groups will be able to use the same legal tactics and influence that white America has utilized for years. Money in the hands of these groups would also be a big reflection of just how far we've come when it comes to money distribution in this country. In Joe Fegan's book, it was explained how monetary handouts used to be exclusively for white Americans during the early 20th century. So reparations in the hands of the descendants of slaves and Native Americans today would just emphasize the strides we've taken from them. This brings me to the end of my section as to how reparations would eliminate prejudice. Just a quick recap, reparations will eliminate prejudice by fostering togetherness and by dismantling barriers. This is also the end of our group's presentation, so class, I leave you with this. It is all, yes, all of our responsibility to consider the steps that we can take to make our theories become a reality. It's all well and good for us to talk about the potential reparations have, but as with anything in life, our actions will always speak louder than our words as to whether we can reach our desired outcomes. And on behalf of our group, we thank you again for your time and attention. Have a great day.